Journeying in Philo's on Abraham. Philo's on Abraham is a Hellenistic biography of the patriarch for praise and instruction, encomiastic and protreptic. Birnbaum and Dillon provide a framework for our understanding the journeying motif in the work. They write as follows. From here, section 60 through 207, Philo will present a series of episodes from Genesis that he construes to be proofs of Abraham's piety. This characterization is consistent with the views of several ancient interpreters that Abraham was tested again and again and was found to be faithful. These tests, or as Philo calls them here, proofs, provide the organizing principle for the first part of Philo's discussion of Abraham's life. In this treatise, Philo uses proof, apodixis, only here. In other contexts, in this treatise where he describes something as the clearest proof, he has the word pistis for proof instead of apodixis. Philo's discussion of Abraham's life consists of 5 episodes on his piety and 3 on his humanity. He employs a journeying motif only in the first set of episodes. Specifically, 3 episodes: Abraham's migrations, he and Sarah in Egypt, and the sacrifice of Isaac include the journeying motif. We shall examine them in that order. In each, the author shows Abraham responding with faithfulness to God related to his journey. The migrations and the journey to sacrifice his son involve divine oracles that Abraham obeys without delay. The episode in the middle, to Egypt with Sarah, lacking such divine word, nevertheless involves similarly prompt response in submission to God in the face of threat from the Pharaoh. We now proceed to Abraham's migrations. First from Chaldea to a desolate place. Philo employs a travel motif to show Abraham carrying out God's will and guidance. The device thereby indicates the author's understanding of the patriarchs following God. Each account follows that in Genesis to a great extent, showing Abraham's obedience to God. Philo, however, construes Abraham's journeying in such a way as to accentuate the patriarch's model behavior and remove his flaws. The travel motif thereby more uniformly indicates conformity to God's will than it would if it became also a means of Abraham's escaping struggles in life, as one finds in the Genesis record. Abraham's journeys in leaving home, Philo recounts in 2 stages. First, leaving Ur to settle in Haran, and subsequently venturing from there. In contrast to the usual reading of Genesis 11:31, Philo represents the departure from Ur as directed by God. In response to an oracle, Abraham hastened eagerly to obey. Disregarding the benefits proffered by God in Haran in Genesis 12, Philo accentuates his hero's piety in obedience. The oracle effected something of a conversion in Abraham's life from the greatest of cities in a culture where the world itself was God to residence with the true God himself. He left as one returning from amid strangers to his home. Philo elaborates on that contrast. When having to leave home, most will yearn to return to kinfolk and country. Philo thus represents God directing his journey as Abraham's way to his home, in contrast to usual understanding of journeys as leading one away from home. He further emphasizes the independence of the patriarch's pilgrimage in noting his departure with only a few, or even alone, contrary to the biblical account where it's the father Terah who leads the entire family in departure from Ur. Arrival in Haran symbolizes spiritual progress in Abraham. The location, whose name in Hebrew means holes, etymologically symbolizes the seat of the senses for Philo, represents progress from Chaldean astrological speculation of God or the world as God. He understands it as the mind's apprehension of God, when God was seen by Abraham, the patriarch being able from his recovered sight to perceive the world as dependent, not governing, but governed by its maker and first cause. This appearance of God for Philo follows immediately the migration from astrology in Chaldea. Philo locates Abraham's spiritual progress then, not so much with word from God at Haran as with God's appearance, which he associates with that city. Specifically, Abraham here comes to the point of, quote, discovery of the one true God. His sight, Philo is at pains to explain, had been shrouded by a great mist, by the things of sense. Only with difficulty could it, his mind, dispel this mist under the warmth and fervor of higher verities, and so be able, as in a clear open sky, to receive the vision of him who so long lay hidden and invisible. Such an unveiling to Abraham revealed God's very nature, so far as the beholder's sight allowed. Our Alexandrian Jewish philosopher next recounts Abraham's second migration, again in obedience to an oracle. Again, he does not specify circumstances of the content of the divine message. He does make clear, however, that the journeying in obedience leads him now not from city to city, but rather into a desolate place. He notes Abraham's willing attitude toward God's instruction, quote, never complaining of the wandering or insecurity which it caused, in spite of the threat to life to people normally. A path not only to be severed from one's own, a burden not only to be severed from one's own country, but also to be driven out of all city life into pathless tracts. Philo proceeds to explain this willingness by relating it to the patriarch's single-minded desire to emulate God. Abraham sought to live without the association of the multitude. Such is natural for those who seek God because solitude is dear to him. Such seekers in this way, first of all, hasten to make themselves like his blessed and happy nature. We conclude that the journeying motif is indispensable for Philo in elucidating his patriarch's spiritual pilgrimage from Chaldea to a desolate place, from the visible to the invisible, from the lesser to the greater in his understanding of God. Now from Syria to Egypt. We examine next the journey motif in Philo's following narrative, that of Abraham's travel to Egypt, in which, not surprisingly, this friend of God continues to exemplify spiritual virtue. The author has written extensively on Abraham's journeys from Chaldea to Haran, and then on to the desolate area to the south in Syria, each leg at the impulse of an oracle. Philo indicates here a new stage in his narrative, noting the preceding as the preliminaries. He employs journeying in his literal understanding of the event. Philo introduces the narrative, noting that while some will not recognize the greatness of Abraham's actions in the move to Egypt, such will eventuate in God's rewarding Abraham in preserving his marriage safe and unharmed when it's subsequently threatened. Relocation is to escape a famine where they have been living in Syria, the name in Philo's day for the southern area of Canaan, where Abraham settled according to his Septuagint record, Genesis 12. The extended nature of the famine accentuates the threat to Abraham's family. Reference to people vacating the cities both underlines the severity of food shortage and suggests that Abraham and his household are urban, not agrarian, as in Genesis. Philo now turns attention to the wife, notably left unnamed until the subsequent allegorical treatment of the incident. Beyond beautiful, as we have it in the biblical narrative, the Alexandrian author waxes encomiastic on her, distinguished greatly for her goodness of soul and beauty of body. Disregarding Abraham's Genesis instruction to Sarah to misrepresent herself to Pharaoh, but acknowledging him as helpless and fearful, the author accentuates the husband's plight as victim by unjustifiably demonizing the Pharaoh as a licentious and hard-hearted tyrant, a pejorative characterization rather than an official title. Continuing in this vein, our author states that the king sends for the woman to be a wife, but in reality to bring her to shame, again contrary to the Genesis account. Having demonized the Pharaoh, the author proceeds to introduce God for punishment of the ruler and rescue of the woman and her husband. Quote, she took refuge along with him in God. God takes retributive action against the king for his intentions and against his household for their consent. He afflicts the ruler with pains, penalties, and plagues. All appetite for pleasure is eradicated and replaced by cravings for release from the endless tortures which day and night haunted and racked him almost to death. Throughout the royal household, preoccupations thus shift from lasciviously dishonoring the beautiful woman to desperately alleviating the king's bodily pain. Philo now notes the benefits accruing to Abraham and his wife in ascending order. First, it is her chastity preserved, and then his nobility and piety evidenced by God. This divine recognition of Abraham manifests itself in that his marriage, in almost immediate danger of violation, should remain free from harm and outrage. Abraham's nobility and piety that gives rise to God's evidence is evidently to be found in the husband's being faithful to God in difficulty, stating in fact, however, only that Abraham in a state of helplessness and fear flees for refuge to God, once again whitewashing the hero. From the city to a certain lofty hill. Philo employs a journey motif, finally, in Abraham's obeying God's direction to sacrifice his son Isaac, the famous Akedah event. He introduces it as the greatest deed of the patriarch, the oracle not characterized as a test, as in the biblical text. Abraham's obedience nevertheless qualifies as proof of his piety. A divine oracle initiates the journey. A word such as he never expected comes to him, quote, to sacrifice his son on a certain lofty hill at a great distance from the city, being a journey of 3 days. After the concise statement of the divine order, Philo expands on Abraham's reaction. Stoic in demeanor from his love for God, he retains his external appearance, resisting internal pull of family relations, and without saying anything to anyone in the household, chooses 2 most devoted servants to join him and his son for the journey as though for a routine ritual. The location then coming into view, he similarly asks the servants to stay behind and gives to his son the fire and the wood. At the son's request about the sacrificial victim, Philo expands again on the father's emotional composure, contrasting the usual person's breakdown in tears, indicating the impending death and Abraham's admitting of no change in either body or mind, with steadfast gaze and steadfast resolve. Then also responding more at length than in the biblical account, Philo's father assures the son, "My child, God will see to a sacrificial victim for himself, even in this vast wilderness," which perhaps makes you give up hope that such will be found, but be well assured that all things are possible for God, even such as would be insuperable and impossible for humans. Among Philo's expansion of the biblical text, he notably inserts that the son may lose hope, thereby implying that the father has not lost hope in the situation. The narrative now grows increasingly dramatic. In this way, the author again accentuates the patriarch's faith in God's good intentions, a demonstration in turn of Abraham's piety. After his extended disquisition, the father now takes action rapidly to consummate the sacrifice of his son, and God responds. The father, quote, snatched up his son, placed him on the altar, and grasping his sword in his right hand, brought it to bear with the purpose of putting him to death. Just as immediately, though, God the Savior intervened first with a voice from the air, ordering him to desist and not to touch the child, and the son is thus preserved. Philo thus makes explicit that God honored Abraham for the deed, returning the gift, Isaac, whether as sacrifice to God or as son to Abraham. In returning the gift, God is as well reciprocating the honor paid to him by the father. Philo insists, in addition, that the father's deed is complete and perfect, even though not brought to a conclusion. Birnbaum and Dillon clarify this, stating Abraham's intention and willingness to sacrifice his son were as important as the deed itself. Abraham's greatest deed in Philo's work is thus brought about through a journeying account. The patriarch's receiving unexpected direction to take his son 3 days from home and to sacrifice him to God. In unquestioning obedience, the father demonstrates his faithfulness to and faith in God to do right by him. Conclusion. Philo employs the journeying motif in 3 episodes to show Abraham's unswerving obedience to God in his life. He first shows his loyalty by journeying on the migrations from Chaldea to Haran and then to the desolate south of Canaan. Next, he and his wife travel to Egypt to escape famine and are entrapped by a villainous lascivious Pharaoh, only to be rescued by God as they turn in faith to him for refuge. Third, Abraham is called on unexpectedly to take that 3-day journey for his greatest deed of faith, to sacrifice his only son to God, but then to be rewarded with the gift returned for his faithfulness. The journey motif thus serves to prove Abraham's piety. While the author might seem to trace Abraham's spiritual progress, the encomium actually presents the life as uniformly obedient, consistently responsive to God, and hospitable to humankind. He does, however, differentiate the role that journeying plays in Abraham's life. Journeying serves to exhibit only his piety toward God, not his hospitality toward humankind.